Before broaching my main topic on the Helvetists and the dames, I'll permit myself a little prelude or prologue, which is nonetheless very much related to the topic. The title of the conference is Rainis and Aspazija among Contemporaries in the European Cultural Context. This title has an assumption under it. Is based on an assumption. The underlying assumption being that Rainis and Aspazija were contemporaries, that is, equals to their European counterparts at the time. And this idea that they were equals evoked memories for me. Several years ago, I was invited to a seminar at Rīga Chateau, where all the movers and shakers of Latvia once a year gather. That is all the who's who in Latvia. I'm usually not there because I'm very far from government. For some reason, I was invited because I had to participate in a discussion with another professor. And in the course of the discussion, in passing, I made a comment that I thought was perfectly innocuous. Because I believed totally that it was true. I didn't even think about it. I'm not averse to being controversial, but I did not think that this comment that I made in passing was at all controversial. What I said at that seminar was that the generation that created the Latvian state in 1918 was more European than the generation that reestablished the Latvian state in 1990. What I didn't expect was the pushback I got from that audience. What I had not taken into consideration was that in that audience were many people from that generation of 1990 who had recreated the state, and they didn't like the idea of being compared to the generation of 1918 and to be found wanting. They did not like that at all. So we got into some rather heated discussions on this topic. I stood my own because I had done, as a young doctoral student in Switzerland, I had studied all those Latvians who studied in Switzerland, who spoke French and German fluently, who had studied at the University of Bern, the University of Geneva, and so forth. And what I wanted, well, you give me some examples from the generation of 1990. Who were the equivalents? Well, the discussion ended with, we agreed that maybe the elites were more European, whereas the general populace, maybe not. But I want you to think about this while I do the presentation and think about whether you can find any equivalence to what Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa did back in 1916. So the Helvetists and the dames. In the collage on the screen, you can see them both. All of these people are real people. These are documentary photos. You are a Latvian audience, so you only probably recognize these two dames on the bottom, Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa. A Swiss audience, however, would recognize all the other men. Most of the bearded gentlemen. There are a lot of bearded gentlemen, but they would recognize the bearded gentlemen, but not the ladies. They all look the same to me. Our topic this morning is about how these two groups met, the Latvian ladies and the Swiss gentlemen, and the extraordinary efforts they made in support of the Latvian cause during the period of 1916 to 1920. First, the gentlemen, or the Helvetists. The brothers on the bottom, Frédéric Ferrière, Louis Ferrière, both famous in their own right. Dr. Frédéric Ferrière was the vice president of the International Red Cross, and the writer, Romain Rolland, you should all know who Romain Rolland is. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1917. In any case, Dr. Frédéric Ferrière, down there on the bottom, was Romain Rolland's favorite candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, not prize in literature. His older brother, Louis Ferrier, there in the middle, chaired the Swiss committee in support of the Latvian cause that was created by Anna Ķeniņa. Pierre Beauvais and Edouard Claparède, there on the top, respectively director and founder of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva, and later of the International Bureau of Education, are also quite famous in Switzerland. But perhaps the only vaguely, perhaps familiar face for Latvians is August Forel up on top. Familiar, perhaps, because maybe you've fingered a 1,000 franc Swiss banknote, maybe 10, 20 years ago. Well, his portrait, August Forel's, was on the front of the 1,000 Swiss franc banknote, and on the back was a drawing of an ant. Why? Because he was a specialist in the life of ants, that is, insects, ants, A-N-T, not A-U-N-T. And also, August Forel's daughter-in-law was a Latvian lady called Lokita Leokādia Upeniece. So, but even though Latvian audiences today know little, if anything, about these gentlemen, all of them back in the day, were all extremely well-versed in Latvian history and culture, writing numerous newspaper articles about Latvia in the Swiss press, organizing events in support of the Latvian cause, and continually reminding the Swiss public that they should support other small nations in distress. Then there are the dames. Why do I give them this derogatory label? Why not call them ladies, at least? And why do I choose to demean them in this way? But notice that there are these quotes around the word dames. And that is because it actually is a quote taken directly from Felix Cielans, future foreign minister of Latvia, but living in Switzerland at the time. A quote and words that he used in a disparaging way to describe the ladies in question, Anna Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa. The exact phrase in Latvian that he used in his letter to Rainis was, tās madāmas. Sorry. Let's take a closer look at these Swiss personalities, these Helvetists. First and foremost, Dr. Frédéric Ferrier, born in Geneva, doctorate in medicine from Heidelberg University, practicing physician in Geneva. His cousin, Louis Appia, was one of the founders of the International Committee of the Red Cross, so he was naturally drawn into working for several ICRC missions in Montenegro, in Greece, and elsewhere. Dr. Ferrier becomes the vice president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and most importantly, under the aegis of the ICRC, creates the International Agency for Prisoners of War in the beginning of World War I. In the Journal des Années de la Guerre, written by Nobel laureate Romain Rolland, that is, my previously mentioned Nobel Prize winner in literature, in his Journal des Années de la Guerre, published in 1952, the name of Dr. Frédéric Ferrier appears 52 times. Why? What's the link between Romain Rolland and Dr. Frédéric Ferrier? Well, in September 1914, Romain Rolland is living in Geneva with his family. At the outbreak of the war, he writes to the president of the International Red Cross, Gustave Ador, pleading that he would like to make himself useful. He was by chance in Geneva when the war broke out. And Ador replies that in his opinion, Rolland could do more for the cause of justice by devoting himself to his writing, not by working for the Red Cross. Rolland's Au-dessus de la mêlée had just appeared in the Journal de Genève in September 1914 at the outbreak of the war. The article, Journal Au-dessus de la mêlée, which later was turned into a book. Rolland, he insists, and he ends up working at the ICRC, International Agency for Prisoners of War, created and run by Dr. Frédéric Ferrière. So important. Finally, Romain Rolland gets his wish. He won't be just writing, he will be also working at the ICRC, Agency for Prisoners of War, created by Dr. Frédéric Ferrière. Here you can see an archive document from the International Red Cross where you can see that Romain Rolland worked from 2 to 5 every afternoon at the agency. As we know, writers don't like to get up early in the morning, so he liked to have his afternoon hours there. And here you can see in the corner there, Dr. Frédéric Ferrière, and in the far corner over there, it's actually Romain Rolland sitting at a desk, actually at a large table, working at the Agency for the Prisoners of War in Geneva, set up and founded by Dr. Frédéric Ferrière. This last name, Ferrière, is going to come up over and over again. Romain Rolland, well, what did the agency do? It served as an intermediary between families and prisoners of war in all camps. The work at the agency corresponded to Romain Rolland's idea of not taking sides, of being au-dessus de la mêlée, his idea of humanism, not pacifism. Romain Rolland worked at the agency run by Frédéric Ferrière for 9 months until July 1915. In 1917, Romain Rolland received the Nobel Prize for Literature, including a prize of 100,000 Swiss francs, a sum which he donated entirely to charity. And half of the sum that he received was donated to this International Agency of Civilian Prisoners of War, founded and run by Dr. Frédéric Ferrière. Rolland greatly admired his friend's strong reaction to all and any injustices and his disdain of the Pharisaism of the virtuous. Here is Romain Rolland's description of his friend Frédéric Ferrière. I quote, "Il était sincère, lui, avec limpidité, comme une source pure." English translation, he was sincere with limpidity like a pure wellspring. Another description from Rolland, "Je ne connais pas dans toute la Suisse française un esprit plus juste et un cœur plus généreux." English translation, "In all of French-speaking Switzerland, I don't know of another more generous heart and equitable spirit." On several occasions, Romain Rolland put forth the candidature of Dr. Frédéric Ferrière for the Nobel Peace Prize. Through the personality of Frédéric Ferrière, not only Romain Rolland, but also other non-Swiss personalities were pulled into the orbit of a unique circle of Swiss intellectuals and humanists who multiplied their efforts in support of elementary decency in the face of the horrors of World War I. And just a little parentheses, after Romain Rolland's article, Au-dessus de la mêlée, appeared in the Journal de Genève in September 1914, Ķeniņa wrote a letter in French in response, which in October 1914 was published next to Romain Rolland's introduction, saying, "Look at the correspondence I got in reply to my article." The older brother of Dr. Frédéric Ferrière, this is important. He was a pastor. Most probably the same generous heart and equitable spirit that animated Frédéric Ferrière animated his brother as well. As a pastor, he was active in the movement for a social Christianity. This inclination to support those who are less fortunate, this sense of decency and obligation to others, most probably was a motivating factor in his decision to take on the leading role at the Comité Suisse d'études de la question lettonne, or the Swiss Committee. It's a very unwieldy translation in English, this French title, this Comité Suisse d'études de la question lettonne. It's like a committee for the study of the Latvian question. In short, I'm just going to call it the Swiss Committee that is the Swiss Committee in Support of Latvians. In any case, Louis Ferrière, the brother of Frederick Ferrière, was the president of this committee instigated by Anna Ķeniņa. This committee, and we'll see who belonged to it and what they did a few slides later, but it was made up of about 30 very, very prominent Swiss, including Louis Ferrière, and their entire circle of Swiss intellectuals at the time. His close relationship, that is the close relationship of Louis Ferrière, the president of the Swiss Committee in Support of Latvia, his close relationship to the famous Dr. Frederick Ferrière added both luster and gravitas to his position and to the Latvian cause. Another member of the Ferrière family, I should say actually illustrious Ferrière family, Adolphe Ferrière, was Frederick's son. Editor of the Christian socialist journal L'Essor, he later was a co-founder of the International Bureau of Education and the International School of Geneva. As just one example of how interconnected all of these Helvetists were, Adolphe, son of Frederick Ferrière, married Auguste Forel's niece. But who was Auguste Forel? Professor of psychiatry and a world specialist on ants, that is insects. As I already told you, that is why you see the 1,000 Swiss franc note down there. His portrait was on it's now no longer in circulation, but it was for about 20 years. Forel's relation to Latvia was not just a result of him belonging to the same circle of leading humanists and intellectuals in French-speaking Switzerland. He also had a private connection. His son, Oskar, was married to a Latvian woman, Leokādija Upiniece, whom he had met when both were studying medicine at the University of Lausanne. Auguste Forel's son, Oskar, also became a psychiatrist, like his father. And in the 1930s, Oskar, son of August, was the first to diagnose the schizophrenia of Zelda Fitzgerald, wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Edward Klapered was another professor of psychology, but also a neurologist and educator. He was the founder of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva, as well as co-founder of the International Bureau of Education, active member of many international organizations with a focus on education and psychology. He was married to the daughter of the Russian philosopher, naturalized Swiss, African Speer. The first of our Helvetists, not linked to medicine or psychology, Benjamin Vallotton, a prolific writer with over 50 books to his name. What does link him to our previous Helvetists, however, his father was a well-known pastor with the same Christian socialist predilections as Louis Ferrière, Adolphe Ferrière, and the others. Pierre Beauvais, professor of education and pedagogy. He was linked to Edouard Klapered, working as the first director of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva that Klapered had founded. Together with Klapered, they are founders of the International Bureau of Education. And here, in that picture there, you can see both Edouard Klapered and Pierre Beauvais, again, looking like twins, even though they're totally different people, in an outing that the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute did at the time. This is an archival photo from the time. Last but not least, another son of a Swiss pastor, Alexis François, professor of French language and philology at the University of Geneva and author of several books. As Alexis François was the only one of these illustrious Swiss for whom it was difficult to find a photo, even on the internet, I put in the forefront a book he wrote, Stendhal, in Geneva, and a small photo of him as a member of the Swiss Student Association, Zofang. Alexis Francois was a Jean-Jacques Rousseau specialist and naturally found himself in the orbit of those who were involved in founding the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute. So these 8 intellectuals and educators, which I just spoke to you about, they were all connected to the Geneva Protestant community, which was concerned, if not passionate, about the idea of social justice. The rights of small nations, this was part and parcel of the humanism which they all espoused. So a few words about the 2 Latvian ladies or dames who quickly began to move in the same circles as all of these 8 Swiss gentlemen. I will not give you a full biography, but I'll limit my comments to their Swiss period. Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa arrived in Switzerland as a student in 1912. Unlike those Latvians who had arrived in Switzerland after the revolution of 1905, she was illegal. She arrived in Switzerland legally. She initially became quite popular in the Latvian exile community in Switzerland. Rainis had a sentence that he wrote to her, "Jūs esat bez kildu pagātnes," you don't have a contentious past. And when Latvians voted in Switzerland on who should be the president of their committee, and don't confuse this committee with the one I'm talking about in the presentation, but in any case, there was a committee that Latvians themselves tried to found with Rainis as the president, and when the exile Latvians in Switzerland voted on who should be president, yes, of course, Rainis got the most votes, but the second in line, the person who got the second most votes, was Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa. So at the time, at the beginning, she was quite popular in the exile community in Latvia. When the Latvian committee was liquidated due to Latvian infighting, Krauze-Ozoliņa helped Anna Ķeniņa in her efforts to set up the Swiss committee. Krauze-Ozoliņa was an active publicist, director of the Press Information Bureau, pro-Letonia in Switzerland, and otherwise an energetic person with a literary flair which Rainis always encouraged her to cultivate. Anna Ķeniņa was the director of a high school or gymnasium in Riga, known for the fact that this school or gymnasium hired a lot of the leading writers in Latvia at that time. Ķeniņa was a pedagogue herself, but in 1912 she got tired of her profession, sold her school, which is now the Riga Secondary School number 40 on Helvēti Street, and then she moved first to France and then to Geneva in 1913 along with her children. Ķeniņa was the main instigator of the Comité Suisse d'études de la question lettonne, or the Swiss Committee for the Support of Latvia. But then the question arises, how was she able to gain access to all of these illustrious Swiss intellectuals, that the 8 gentlemen and more that what was the connection? She was a foreigner. She had no real access. How did she get this access? The link was the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute in Geneva, where Ķeniņa enrolled in 1913. And if you look at this course plan for the Institute for 1913-1914, the first year that Ķeniņa attended, you can see many, which should be by now familiar names. Claparède, Beauvais, Ferrière, they were all teachers at this very recently founded Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute. Classes were small, and the opportunity to get to know her professors was large. Okay, this is supposed to be interactive here, but what? Okay, I won't. That's one of the most interesting. I guess it's not showing up on the screen here. In any case, this should be here in that black dark spot, the Livre d'Or of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, where you have Anna Ķeniņa's inscription. You have the other students at the Institute at the time, but you actually have her handwritten inscription Maybe we'll pull it up later. I don't know why it's not showing, because you can actually flip the pages and open to where she has her handwritten inscription in perfect French. Although her handwriting is not at all perfect classic French handwriting. It's quite difficult to read, actually. But she has a beautiful inscription in that Livre d'Or of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute. And in the book, she writes that she grew tired of working as a principal of the gymnasium in Riga, sold it to a group of friends, and then she went abroad. She hopes, however, and here's the quote that she writes in French, I've translated it into English. She writes that she hopes, however, to still have something to say in that which concerns the organization of education in my homeland, if only she doesn't succumb to the horrible blows that her land and people are subjected to from both sides. So she was already feeling that Latvia was being caught between two different forces. The Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, which Ķeniņa attended from 1913 to 1915. In some of the Latvian literature, it says she graduated in 1916. Sorry, the original Swiss documents show that she graduated in 1915, not in 1916. But the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute was founded as a school for education, for the practical application of new educational theories in child development. Initially, the institute was an independent institution, but later became attached to the University of Geneva. The famous psychologist Jean Piaget became the director of the institute in 1921, succeeding Pierre Bovet. As the institute was an innovative institution, it used innovative methods. It had its own school for children, where it applied its theories in placing the child, not the teacher, at the center of activities. Students and teachers at the Institute intermingled freely and frequently joined together on excursions in the Geneva countryside. Here is Edouard Claparède, looking decidedly less formal than he did in the previous portrait I showed you. The group on the bottom here, which is all from the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, they are imitating psychosomatic states. And that is the Institute flag there to the right. And up above, you can see both Edouard Claparède and Jean Piaget with his trademark glasses and pipe. These informal relations bred an atmosphere of confidence, which surely explains why Anna Ķeniņa felt that she could, on several occasions, take the liberty of asking Edouard Claparède to lend her money. In a letter dated 5 June 1916, she even goes so far as suggesting that she will send her son to Claparède's home that very afternoon to pick the money up. These letters are all in the University of Geneva library. You can see that she's not just once, but several times asking Edouard Claparède for money. But you can understand, this is 1916. It's very difficult for her to get the money from Moscow, where her husband is at the time, and sending her money. So I have the letters with me, but I will not dwell on them at this point. Anna Ķeniņa was able to realize her goal of forming a group in Switzerland which would visibly and vocally support the Latvian cause, firstly, because the Swiss intellectuals in question were predisposed to support such causes. Secondly, both Ķeniņa and the Swiss in question had a common professional interest in educational reform. Thirdly, the friendly atmosphere at the Institute was conducive to forming networks of similarly minded people. Both Ķeniņa and Krauze-Ozoliņa were regularly invited to the salon of Louis Ferrière, where like-minded idealists gathered. The final list of the 30 or more Swiss who joined together to form the Comité Suisse d'études de la question lettonne in late 1916 was an impressive roster of intellectual luminaries in French-speaking Switzerland. But not only, you can see the whole list there. It's not only the 8 I mentioned, but in the middle you have the entire list. And one of the most effective events organized by this Swiss committee was a large Assemblée populaire, or popular assembly, on 4 March 1918, the tenor of the speeches held on the occasion being all the more impassioned for the fact that the news of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty had reached Geneva that very morning. The event was held at the main meeting hall in Geneva at that time, the Salle de la Réformation, which you can see here. And it is the same hall, the same meeting hall, that was used for the first General Assembly of the League of Nations in 1920. That is the picture in the middle. Speakers at the 4 March 1918 event, organized by the Swiss Committee in Support of Latvia, included Ķeniņa herself, but also Swiss intellectuals who you should be familiar with by now: Pierre Beauvais, Louis Ferrière, Benjamin Valaton. You can see the names up there. The event resonated throughout Geneva, if not further, and the members of the Swiss Committee, energized by the momentum, continued to actively published articles in the Swiss press in support of the Latvian cause. The brochure at the far end, you see, is a compilation of all the speeches that were given on that March day in Geneva. All of this activity in support of the Latvian cause, done by the Swiss themselves, not by the Latvians, by the Swiss themselves. Now, this could only be met with approval and applause by all Latvians, no? I mean, they're doing it for free, pro bono, altruistically. Yeah? So Latvians should support it unilaterally, of course. Well, no. And one of those who disapproved, or at least didn't actively support, was Rainis. The first signs of conflict emerged when August Forel was asked to join the Swiss committee. Remember, Forel's daughter-in-law was a Latvian, and his niece was married to Adolphe Ferrière. So he was very much of the circle who had already joined the Swiss committee. But August Forel was also a socialist, as was Rainis, as we know. So August Forel asks Rainis's opinion concerning this committee initiated by Ķeniņa. So August Forel writes to Rainis, well, what do you think of Ķeniņa's initiative? I support it. We think it's wonderful, all these Swiss leading intellectuals. Rainis replies to Forel, clearly indicating his position. On the right there, Mrs. Ķeniņa has placed herself at the head of this organization here, but what is her position in Latvia? There, the lady and her husband don't represent a political party or movement or thought, and that Rainis thinks is a bad thing when you don't represent a political party or movement or thought. But instead gather around themselves some Latvian artists and writers, as well as students of the high school that they, the Ķeniņš, founded, and they try to influence society. They use the tumult of these times only to make politics, patriotism with a religious hue and anti-socialism. Cooperating with anti-socialistic elements is not possible for me, nor is it necessary. That's one letter that Forel receives. He also receives a letter from Anna Ķeniņa, who writes to Forel with a different stance. She tells Forel, personally, I don't belong to any political party, but I can affirm with my head held high that my opinions in this matter are entirely democratic, and I am sure that there are no differences between me and Monsieur Rainis as to the past of our people and the projects and hopes of the future of our people. So Forel is caught in the middle, but finally he does decide to join, as Rainis calls it, Ķeniņa's committee, despite Rainis's admonishments, a decision prompted, it seems, not so much by the desire to take sides with one or another Latvian camp as by a sense of solidarity with his own Swiss intellectual milieu. August Forel forwards Rainis's response to Pierre Beauvais, which in turn moves Beauvais to address Rainis personally on 21 December 1916. Beauvais addresses Rainis in an extremely courteous manner, taking care to explain that, I quote, our idea is not to take up the cause of one politics over another, especially we wouldn't dream of attaching ourselves to one political party over another, that is one Latvian political party over another. But Beauvais' careful approach falls on deaf ears. And Rainis replies, I quote, my participation in the committee would be disorienting as I have a different party view which doesn't allow me to go together with her, meaning Ķeniņa. Well, not surprisingly, this sort of logic fails to leave the desired impression on Pierre Beauvais, citizen of a country with one of the oldest democratic traditions in Europe. Putting aside the polite, friendly tone of his initial approach to Rainis, Pierre Beauvais, remember, this is an important person. He's the director of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Institute, co-founder of the International Bureau of Education. He shoots back to Rainis a missive expressing his painful surprise, the painful surprise that Rainis's position has caused him, and his failure to understand why, if Rainis admits that the Swiss committee will be good for Latvians, why nonetheless he refuses his collaboration, all because, and I quote, one of your compatriots, of course Ķeniņa, with whom we are in contact does not inspire your confidence, really, sir. I expected something else from your great experience of men and things. I would be happy if you would reconsider and our committee could benefit from the light and brilliance of all Latvians, including your own. Well, Rainis wastes no time in responding and finds an artful dodge, wishing the committee the best success, but since it is a committee comprised only of Swiss members, his own membership or non-membership is not an issue in any case. Is the issue here really one of party affiliation, or does it go beyond that? The Swiss find it difficult to understand the Latvian inability to see the greater cause, the bigger picture, the ideal that motivates the Swiss themselves. At closer examination, other issues were in play which can be ascertained when one examines some of the correspondence, unpublished to date, between Rainis and Felix Cielāns, Rainis and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa at the time. Felix Cielāns was to become Latvia's Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1926, but in 1916, he was living in Switzerland and actively participating in the activities of the Latvian Social Democratic Party, sometimes too actively and dogmatically, for which he received some criticism from Rainis. But here are a few phrases from Felix Cielāns' correspondence with Rainis in 1916 to mull over. I will not read them all, but just to give you an idea of the tenor and the mindset of Felix Cielāns at the time. We're just going to have to be more strict with Mrs. Ķeniņa. She doesn't show even the most elementary womanly shame. It's such egregious pushiness. He's talking about Ķeniņa. Here, and the last quote I will read, but those dames probably thought, those dames, and this is where the title of my lecture here is taken from, where the quote is taken from, those dames, that is Felix Cielāns writing to Rainis in 1916 concerning Anna Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa. He says, but those dames probably thought that they would be sent to the diplomatic congress as Latvia's representatives, from where they would haggle over freedom for Latvians. Wouldn't that be a fantastic show in front of the world? it seems that those dames also wanted a place for themselves among the greats of world history. Yeah, that's Tielands in 1916. So, egregious pushiness. Those dames also wanted a place for themselves among the greats of world history. Doesn't one detect here not only a note of party dogmatism, but also chauvinism? But this time, this Rainis, not Forel, is in the middle. And he is receiving correspondence from Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa as well. She, being a good writer, has pithily phrased sentences. I will just read a couple of them. Here you have my selection, but I will only read a couple. She writes to Rainis, 1916 again, everyone here has their own worldview, already solidly constructed and cemented. Then they proceed to continually carry it around with them like a snail shell, not coming out even for a moment. In New York, there are 30 Latvian associations and about a dozen Latvian newspapers. Each one has the proper seal of approval. Each one follows their only right and righteous path, and the other one is a hooligan or worse. And during this time, the Germans, you disapprove of Ķeniņa, who got the ball rolling with all of these Swiss. Okay, but then why does the thing itself need to be abandoned? Swiss people from different parties can unite in the name of Latvian self-determination, but we Latvians, no. So we have a common cause to die for, but we have nothing in common to live for. No shared Latvian resolve, which unites everyone? I believe that there is. So this phrase, the Swiss people can unite in the name of Latvian self-determination. All these Swiss intellectuals, but we Latvians, no? Pierre Beauvais and Auguste Forel had no great difficulty in finding a common ground, due in part to the fact that their common history had been largely lacking in violent discord. This was not the case for Latvia. One of the reasons Tielands refused to work with Ķeniņa was his conviction that Ķeniņa and her husband had been sympathetic to the repressive organs in Latvia after the revolution of 1905. Regardless if it was true, Tielands perceived it to be true. Nonetheless, a united front in support of the Swiss who were doing so much to assist the Latvian cause would have done no harm to either Rainis or Tielands, despite their socialist convictions. Was there not perhaps another factor that played a determining role here, something that rears its ugly head in Tielands' letters to Rainis? Were they not just a bit jealous that after the failure of their own committee, those dames had managed on their own to set up quite an effective enterprise? Subsequently, both the dames put their talents to work for the newly founded Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Latvia. Anna Ķeniņa as the head of the Latvian press office in Paris, and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa in Berlin as the provisional head of the Latvian diplomatic representation there. But their careers within the Latvian Foreign Service were very short-lived. This is not surprising, as the Latvian Foreign Ministry was a man's world during the interwar period. Given the attitudes expressed by Tielands in his letters to Rainis in 1916, in what way could one expect that Tielands' mindset would have significantly changed by the time he assumed the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1926? Those dames, they wanted a place for themselves among the greats of world history. Well, there was not enough room among the greats for the men as it was. Final two slides. The activities of the Swiss committee, or the Comité Suisse d'études de la question lettonne, did not end with the departure of Ķeniņa and Krauze-Ozoliņa from Switzerland. In 1920, when Latvia was looking for admission to the League of Nations, the same roster of illustrious Swiss names wrote a letter in support of Latvia's admission to the League of Nations Secretariat, signed in the name of the entire committee, but submitted by Alexis Francois. You can see Alexis Francois' name right there. Remember, he's our author of Stendhal in Geneva. And he's also a University of Geneva professor at the time. Paul Montu, the first director of the League of Nations Secretariat, replies to Alexis Francois, you can see the second letter there, mentioning that, oh, the letter you submitted in support of Latvia's admission to the League of Nations is full of very important signatures, assuring Alexis Francois that the letter will be distributed to all the necessary people. The archive copies you see on the screen, they are from the League of Nations archives in Geneva. So, Ķeniņa's committee, even without her presence, continued to work for Latvia, attesting to the fact that the Swiss humanist tradition in support of social justice was an integral part of the culture and value system of this particular group of Swiss intellectuals, requiring no prodding from the outside, a tradition that Latvian intellectuals were still aspiring to. Rainis continually encouraged Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa to cultivate her literary gifts, which are evident in the letters that she writes, especially the unpublished ones. A poetic gift is also a prophetic gift. And as Krauze-Ozoliņa writes to Rainis in late 1916, this conflict, that is, of who can or cannot belong to the Swiss committee, will end with my being declared a bourgeois, an anti-democrat, etc. And nonetheless, it is my feeling that these declarations, this hounding of the nonconformist, this fanaticism which is achieved at the cost of intellectual dishonesty, this exaggerated importance of the one and only right and real one, that is our culture's current and also still our future greatest danger. I've put up the original Latvian as well, because the nice alliterations, the beautiful alliterations and the rhythm of the language is difficult to translate. So, in closing, back to my initial reflection, the prelude or the prologue. The initial reflection on the fact that the generation that created the Latvian state in 1918, that they were greater Europeans than the generation that reestablished the Latvian state in 1990. At one level, yes, but that doesn't mean that the generation of 1918 also didn't have a lot of growing to do. This hounding of the nonconformist, this fanaticism which is achieved at the cost of intellectual dishonesty, such was our culture's current and future danger then, and such it is also today, and not only in Latvia. So, thank you.
Each speaker will get this lovely souvenir mug, very comfortable for travels,
Okay.
holidays, or exile.
Okay, right now I'll put in my little utensils. Thank you, thank you.
So, please, you are very welcome to ask questions to Mrs. Matiss. May I start this discussion with one question? We are seeing the support for the Latvian cause. What about Estonians and Lithuanians? Was there a concept of the Baltics at the time, or that was exclusively like for Latvians or separate nations?
No, there were active individuals in Switzerland supporting also Lithuanian and Estonian, especially Lithuanian independence. But there you had a slightly different situation. There you had people of like Lithuanian origins who had lived for years in Switzerland. They were not exiles after 1905. So there's a whole separate issue of a Congress of Nationalities that Ķeniņa participated in as well, I think it was 1916 as well, where there was an issue of whether the Germans have taken over the Congress, and there were a lot of debates between Rainis and Ķeniņa and others whether they should participate in this Congress because it was supposedly surreptitiously organized by the secret services of Germany. And a very prominent person involved in that Congress was a Lithuanian by the name of Gabris. So.
Thank you. More questions, please.
Yeah.
I have a question about Leo Harvey upēniece.
Yeah.
What kind of role, if any, she did have in that creating of networking?
She was against Ķeniņa as well. If you go, she was against Ķeniņa as well. No. Sorry, no solidarity among women here. There's a whole archive, the Forel archive in Switzerland, where you can see her letters to Forel, and they start with "Mon cher papa." She called Forel always her papa, and they're all in French, and what she's not very flattering about Ķeniņa. She calls Ķeniņa full of pride, arrogant, all of these, the pushy, egregious pushiness that she also, and she told her papa not to join the committee. So no, she was also against Ķeniņa at the time, and there are letters that attest to her negative stance towards Anna Ķeniņa. So no solidarity there, unfortunately. Maybe it makes for a better story if there isn't the solidarity. Yeah?
But would it be possible for you to imagine the character of Ķeniņa itself? You have so many testimonies that she was greedy, pushy, etc.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea about what kind of person she was?
Not really. She was also a good writer. You need to know also that both of these dames, as I took Cielan's quote there just to make the title more attractive, were actually good writers as well, both Jūrmala Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa. And what she was like as a person, she has so many different facets to her personality, and so contradictory as well. And this is not my specialty. This is something that is like a hobby for years. I'm not a specialist researcher on the subject. So I really haven't looked into depth into Ķeniņa's character. But that she was quite confident for a woman of her time. That's very, very clear. And to be a confident woman at the time, in that atmosphere, I think I put those quotes by Cielan's up there on purpose because it gives you an idea of the mindset of the male ruling class at that time. Just so you know, those letters aren't published. They're unpublished letters of Cielan's. He has an image of being a very, serious man or so forth. But Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa, in one of her letters to Rainis, calls Cielan's a little boy. I've always thought him mas puišelis. I always thought of him as a little boy. So there was a lot of name calling going around among these people. That's, I think, harkens back to our days as well. That's a lot of ad hominem attacks there. So, I wish I had a better, that photo of hers is extremely, expressive, that's, but no, I can't really answer your question because I've never looked into her personality in great depth. So I've just looked into the story of this committee and more on the Swiss side there. Okay.
We have another question.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. It was amazing, and I really enjoyed it very much. So, going back to the last quotation of your presentation about the future great danger, you also somehow compare it to the situation nowadays. So if we see that this kind of discourse and the tradition of pejorative names and these quarrels continues in the generation of the 90s now, so what are now the most topical danger for Latvian culture if we talk about the generation of the elites now? So what would you say about this quotation? How topical is it still like 100 years later?
I'll try to be diplomatic. I'll try to answer this question diplomatically. I think it's still quite topical. But a lot of this name calling, it happens behind closed doors. I think we can all feel in our Latvian politics here that a lot of the political problems are not really based in disagreements on policy, but they are often rooted in personal likes and dislikes among personalities. And that is something that I feel that, okay, progress hopefully has been made since 1918 or 1916, but this fact that it's all based on personalities, I like, I don't like, rather than the larger global issue that like the Swiss dealt with, you know, and there's that wonderful quote by Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa, okay, so you don't like Ķeniņa, but why should you drop the whole cause? You know, the cause is worth it, so what's your dislike or like for Ķeniņa really got to do with it? So that's, I think there's still a great aspect of this today, unfortunately, in Latvia's politics. And that's why I think this history lesson from back then, before Latvia even became independent, and I didn't even bring up the issue of the Latvian committee, which preceded the Swiss committee, where you have all the same problems, but even more blown up, because there were no Swiss involved. It was just the Latvians among themselves. And the Rainis even wrote a famous article saying, you know, a failed experiment, which was the Latvian committee that they formed in Switzerland in 1915, and which was dissolved in 1916. And again, even for that Latvian committee, Rainis didn't want Ķeniņa to be a member, even for that. It's not so clear cut, you know, this, I think, and I don't want to be overly critical of Rainis, because he often, when Cielāns went over the top and exaggerated in his criticisms of Ķeniņa and Austra Krauze-Ozoliņa, he would tell Cielāns to stop. And when Cielāns became too much of a dogmatic socialist, he also told Cielāns to stop. So I do not want to paint Rainis entirely as a dogmatic socialist, but he was somewhere in the middle between Cielāns' extreme on the one side and Ķeniņa's not belonging to any party on the other side. And there's also a wonderful quote that I didn't put up, and that is Krauze-Ozoliņa's, Cielāns saying about Krauze-Ozoliņa that viņa nenoteikts cilvēks, that she's undefinable. She's a socialist, a nationalist, a this and that. She's everything at the same time, and that's a no-no. You know, you have to be clearly defined. You have to be either a socialist or a liberal. You know, you have to be able to put this person in a category. And Cielāns says, you know, I can't put Krauze-Ozoliņa in a category. So, in any case, the whole story, I left a lot out, but the whole story also of Krauze-Ozoliņa in Switzerland is really quite fascinating, because the Swiss secret police followed her, by the way. You know, you can find documents from 1918, 1919, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Where you can see this, that the Swiss police followed her around. So they must have had their suspicions.
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
Yeah.
Yes, just a short question. I'm coming from a completely different country, so I wasn't really aware a lot of this strong support that developed in Switzerland regarding the Latvian independence movement and so. So my question is broader, and perhaps it is difficult to answer it, but I wonder, could you try to assess the role of this support from abroad? Perhaps it was also developing elsewhere, not only in Switzerland, I don't know. But do you think this was very important for the Baltic states to gain independence at this particular movement? Because I think, I mean, probably it was more the result of the specific geopolitical constellation which offered this, I think, unique window or opportunity for the Latvian states. Okay.
Very good question, and it's not limited only to the time period that I covered. I think the diasporas of the Baltic countries, all three of them, have played a huge role in supporting the cause of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, respectively, in all periods of time when Latvia was not an actor itself. Latvia, you could almost say that these diaspora activists like Ķeniņa and like during the 1980s in the United States and so forth, it was an act without an actor. You know, Latvia was not independent yet, but you had people lobbying for Latvian independence. So I think they were crucial because in Latvia itself you couldn't do it. So the diasporas and what the diasporas could do to gather around them important intellectuals or politicians was absolutely key. And this repeated itself in the 1980s as well with the lobbying that organizations like Batum did in New York City and so forth. So yes, it was absolutely crucial. But here I get back to my initial comment, and that is that you have to take into consideration that both Ķeniņa and Krauze-Ozoliņa, they spoke fluent, respectively, French and German, and they could communicate with these peoples, not only just barely communicate, but write fluently in these languages. And this was key to being accepted into these circles. Without the languages, without Ķeniņa's perfect French, without Krauze-Ozoliņa's perfect German, being able to infiltrate into these Swiss intellectual circles would not have been possible at all. But for all the other reasons, so it was personal lobbying. They were exiles in a way not. Krauze-Ozoliņa, they could both go back. The two ladies could go back, and they did eventually. But to Latvia, that is, once Latvia became independent. But the diasporas, to answer your question, yes, very, very, very key role. I would say a huge role while Latvia wasn't independent.
Thank you. Do we have the last question?
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. It's all new for me, so maybe my question will be very, very broad or uninformed, but I wanted to ask about the role of religion and the religious background of, I don't know, the personalities, or did it have any role, because in some other cases comparable of the small nations that would be coming into existence in 1917, 18, it had a huge role, so I was just curious about this. Thank you.
Well, as one of the quotes that I quoted by Rainis, when he wrote to Forel, one of the things he complained about concerning Ķeniņa was that she had this religious hue, you know, which was a negative for him. But I think overall, to answer your question, when I think of all these characters, that is the Latvian side, not necessarily. Maybe, as I said, this is not my specialty, but I don't think so. But as far as the Swiss side is concerned, I already mentioned that these were all pastors, sons of pastors, but they were not dogmatic Christians. They were in the good old Geneva, French-speaking part of Switzerland tradition of Protestantism, which was you give to others, you look to the greater good. It's a tradition of social justice. They were all part of this very ingrained and very important tradition in Switzerland, and that is which included supporting small oppressed countries. And Latvia wasn't the only one. At the same time, Klapered's brother was supporting the independence of Norway, for instance, which also didn't happen so very, very long ago. So they were very, very much ingrained in this tradition. It's a very specific tradition. You've got to understand it to understand why they would all get on board to support Latvia at the time in 1916. And that was a common thread, if you saw. That's why I usually don't emphasize that so-and-so is a pastor or not a pastor. But in this very specific case, it's important. It's a common thread that weaves throughout the biographies of all of these Swiss personalities. And that specific religious aspect is not at all fanatic. You've got to, this is a religious tradition in Switzerland that is not at all fanatic. Let's put Calvin aside here. But it's based on social justice and equality and the common good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.